Hello, welcome to this symposium by Hillsdale College on the pressing topic of the day, the coronavirus. And I've got three panelists here with me, and they're colleagues and friends of mine. They're all from the politics department. And Kevin Porteous here is PhD, University of Dallas, and Adam Carrington is a PhD, Baylor, and Tom West is a PhD, Claremont Graduate School, back when it was called the school, as it was when I got mine there. And we haven't talked much about this. I hear a little bit of what they think. I'll open with one quick point, and that is I was talking this afternoon with my friend Hugh Hewitt, who's, of course, up to all kinds of mischief. And I made a point to him that struck him, so I'll make it to you. This is like war in some respects. But there's two things you should think about that. And one is Churchill cautioned constantly against treating anything in domestic policy like a war, because any serious war suspends the liberal society. And you can't be having that. He wrote that in 1936 in a reaction to Franklin Roosevelt's War on Poverty, first one proclaimed. The second point is it's not very honorable, if you're fighting in a war, to just be confined to your home. In a war, there's stuff for people to do. They can make a contribution. They can feel part of it. So this has those two aspects. And Churchill always thought, if you get in a big war, first of all, don't get in one. Second of all, get it over as fast as you can. Well, surely in this case, we need to get this over as fast as we can. That's my comment. And Kevin?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Arnn. I've been asked to talk specifically about coronavirus as a kind of war. We are being told this is a war. Our own governor got on television recently and said that this is like World War II and that we need to treat it as such. And I'd just like to talk about a couple of problems or difficulties which Dr. Arnn introduced, but also to expand on those a little bit. The first problem is that wars traditionally, of course, lead to expansion of power. Now, the traditional American way of war was to build up the government to win the war and then dismantle it, so that during the American Civil War, within a few years after the end of the war, about all that was left was veterans' pensions and the Freedmen's Bureau. Most of the infrastructure that had been built up to win the war had been dismantled. After the First World War, progressives were forced to watch in a kind of horror as Republicans in the 1920s under Harding and Coolidge dismantled much of the administrative apparatus that had been built up during the Wilson administration to win the war. They'd done all kinds of things. They'd seized control of industries. They had built entire new administrative agencies, and there were many that were hopeful that this kind of national control over the economy and over the life of the citizenry would continue after the war, and that was not to be. The new American way of war, beginning with the Second World War, is that we build up additional government infrastructure to win the war, and then that infrastructure never goes away. And this, as I said, began with World War II, and we're still left with things, some of which are very ordinary, like tax-free employer-sponsored health insurance and paycheck deductions as legacies of the growth of the state, not to mention much more major increases in the size of the state. And each one layers on top of the last, so that every time we have a new crisis, we build up additional infrastructure, and that infrastructure remains. We should never let a good crisis go to waste. Second, there is, over the course of the 20th century, there's a change in the nature of the way we understand war, particularly as we move away from the traditional meaning of war as armed combat against a foe, another nation, as it were. And that was the old understanding. Wars, in the traditional sense, were waged against well-defined foes, the Confederacy, Kaiser Bill, the Nazis, whoever the case may be. And the objective to be achieved was reasonably concrete. Defeat the enemy's armies in the field, force the capitulation of the armies and the government, and they did require, in many cases, massive national mobilization, but only for a relatively short period of time. Now that's changed. We have a new understanding, In the Great Depression, FDR cast the Depression as a war, and in his first inaugural address demanded wartime powers in order to solve the crisis. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that this is not actually a war. The enemy is an economic crisis and the fear that it bred. And the Constitution treats war and economic crisis differently. Now, the Great Depression was still somewhat limited in that we knew that the Depression was an extraordinary situation, and we knew what normal looked like: employment, prosperity, etc. But the solution that Roosevelt employed was a permanent transformation of the regime. Kennedy, in his first inaugural address, talking about the Cold War, was unable to clearly define the nature of the enemy and the nature of the objectives, so that he declared that this was a struggle against the common enemies of man: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Lyndon Johnson, in his War on Poverty, literally declared war on what had previously been understood as an immutable part of the human condition. And victory was defined as the eradication of poverty, but one must ask, what constitutes the eradication of poverty? Reagan in the War on Drugs, George W. Bush on the War on Terror. Bush wouldn't even define the precise nature of the enemy. And it looks very much, if we went back in time, like FDR's freedom from fear. What does victory look like? How do we achieve an end to terror? The mission morphed from killing jihadis to regime building all over the world. And what did we get? Perpetual war in order to transform regimes abroad, and many of the elements of a police state here at home. The war on coronavirus is shaping up to look like one of these modern wars. Massive intrusion of government into our lives, economic shutdowns, violations of constitutional and natural rights, medical martial law, but also mission creep and ill-defined goals. What began as 15 days to flatten the curve is now, if it even saves one life, or until there's a vaccine, or until there are no more outbreaks. But what's an outbreak? How many people is an outbreak? These are not rational ways to make policy. Now, in a sense, that's desirable. Our politicians kind of like that because, on the one hand, it means that if they don't set goals, concrete objectives, they can't be criticized for the failure to achieve them. And on the other hand, it means that those that want to can extend their authoritarian regimes indefinitely. So I would suggest that there are massive problems with trying to think of something that's not a war as a war, and we need to be clear about things like objectives and what the purpose of this is, and rational relationship between the objective and the goals to be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam.
Yeah, thank you. And we are speaking together today about coronavirus and the Constitution. In other words, measuring the response to the circumstance by the standard of our governing document. However, there has not been an American response to the coronavirus, I would say. There have been responses. I say that because states have taken the lead regarding most of the actions addressing its spread, and those responses have taken a variety of courses regarding, as Dr. Porteous was saying, the status of schools. I would add restaurants, defining workers as essential or non-essential, permitting gatherings of a certain size, and so on. And in assessing state responses constitutionally, some have employed the term police powers to describe the authority they've exercised. And I've been asked, and I will be talking a bit about what these powers are. They're not a normal phrase within our commonplace discussions, and how they relate to our theory of constitutional government and the circumstances at least similar to our own. And to understand police power, we have to consider more fundamental questions, both the divided powers and the united purpose of our government. I begin with the divided powers. America does not have one ruling body or even one government. We, the people, ordained and established a constitution organizing political power along two lines. The first, that I won't talk as much about right now, is the separation of powers, whereby we divided our national government's authority into distinct branches according to legislative, executive, and judicial functions. The second was federalism, the division of political power between one national versus many state governments. Defining police powers begins with this latter constitutional structure. And Federalist 45, I think, helps us to understand better the Constitution's federalism. It makes distinct assumptions regarding national as opposed to state governments. Publius there said that, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite." We see this assumption made in the 10th Amendment as well, where it declares that, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or the people." In other words, the Constitution gives the national governments power by positive declaration. It assigns the state governments their authority by permission. They or the people possess anything not otherwise allotted or prohibited. Many have summarized these reserved or permitted powers as the police power. And I would say that in American history, some leave it there. The states can do anything they wish, so long as no explicit limit or other allocation exists in the Constitution's text. But I think this understanding is insufficient. Its insufficiency stems from not addressing what unifies our various governments. While differing in allotment of powers, they share a common purpose. This purpose we find summarized in the Declaration of Independence, as I'm sure you're aware, where it says that governments exist to secure the inalienable rights of human beings, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The national government does so in its constitutionally granted sphere. The states do in theirs. Regarding this united purpose but divided powers, I think Federalist 45 again articulates it nicely. Publius argued that the national government, quote, "will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. These concerns involve the protection of rights. These also comprise issues that we hold in common as a nation," and we can see possibly response regarding COVID-19 that may fall under its sphere. But the same essay then argues that, quote, "the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state." Here we see that the states not only protect individual rights, they form the ordinary, normal means for that task. At least most of the instances where we need our rights secured is left to the states to do. And to dig a little deeper into how this has been understood, I want to turn to the Supreme Court because it's, I think, spent the most time of the institutions developing and trying to articulate this principle. Over the course of 2 centuries, in fact, it has developed a shorthand, almost formulaic in its description, regarding what state police power seeks to do. This shorthand typically involves protections for the health, safety, good order, even the morals of the people. And I would argue that these categories, rightly understood, involve the protection of the rights discussed before. For our purposes, the first two, health and safety, require greater focus. Health and safety connect to the right to life. Infringing either can result in death. But I would also point out that attacks on both threaten our liberty as well, dissuading, if not outright denying us free action. We can see a host of examples of state regulations grounded in protecting our health and our safety. Laws requiring licensing for medical doctors, for instance. Speed limits, drunk driving laws, even requirements for a driver's license itself, all come under attempts to protect the safety of those on the road. These regulations do have a limit, though. Government exists to protect natural rights, but it can be an abuser of those rights too. Federalist 51 stated this well, noting that government exists because men are not angels, and limits on government exist because men, not angels, administer it. Thus, claims to health and safety void of substance are oppression, not protection. And I'd say here, as with federalism, both the powers and restraints of state police powers unify under the goal of rights protection. During normal times, and I was thinking of this when Dr. Porteous was talking, we get a feel for where the lines exist between rights protecting police regulations and rights oppressing ones. These times, we hear, are not normal. In emergencies, I would say the goal remains the same, but the lines can change. A good example from the Supreme Court comes in the 1905 case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts. That's been coming up a lot lately. Massachusetts faced a smallpox outbreak, and the state authorized localities to require vaccinations among the people. one resident sued, saying this requirement violated his liberty. And what's interesting is the court affirmed the right to liberty, saying that the liberty secured by the Constitution does not import an absolute right in each person to be at all times and in all circumstances, basically to do whatever he wants. Instead, quote, there are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. In pursuit of this common good, by the government involved, they said the police power of the state, which, quote, must be held to embrace, at least, such reasonable regulations established directly by legislative enactment as will protect the public health and public safety. There are those criteria. And the main point of this restraint had to do with those actions which, they said, involved injury that may be done to others. Injury meaning private actions that violated rights. And in this instance, the court considered it legitimate to call a smallpox outbreak an emergency. Health and safety regulations, including forced vaccinations, proceeded, quote, upon the principle of self-defense of paramount necessity. In other words, the argument was this is an instance of self-defense for the life of the individuals involved, if not the community itself. And taken to our current situation, the claim of pandemic, if true, gives significant regulatory power. At the same time, this power isn't unlimited. For one, health and safety must be considered together with other rights, including liberty of movement and property, not least property in one's employment. To focus on just one without the other is to sell short the full purpose of police power. For another, and I think this builds on what Dr. Porteous was saying, we the people must be vigilant in assessing the original and ongoing reality of claims to emergency police powers. We need concrete definitions in defense of the emergency. We need clear articulation of the rights state actions claim to protect. Then we should demand similarly lucid defenses of the connection between the emergency, the response by the government, and the rights that response secures. Vagaries in this instance will not do, especially with so much upheaval already suffered by so many Americans. In sum, states' exercises of police powers in this time must have a standard and a judge. The standard, the principles and text of the Constitution; the judge, the ultimate source of power, we the people.
Thank you. Tom?
I'm going to differ somewhat from my colleague who just spoke, Dr. Carrington. I believe America's state and local governments are engaging in an unprecedented denial of the most important natural rights of the people. There has been no significant difference between Republicans and Democrats with regard to the response to the virus. Worst of all, there has been almost no serious resistance to the suspension of natural and civil rights. Politicians, our despicable news media, and most citizens have been complicit. There's nothing close to a precedent for all of this in American history. It's one thing to require a vaccination. It's another thing to confine most of the nation to house arrest and shutting down half the economy. And yet all of this has been done not with a bang or even with a whimper. What are our natural rights? Our Declaration speaks of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Other founding documents add the right to free exercise of religion and the right to acquire and possess property. The purpose of government, as the Declaration says, is to secure these rights. These words are so familiar that for most of us, they've been emptied of any real meaning beyond what we vaguely remember from high school history courses and the like. We don't any longer have in our guts a real sense of what they mean. And I'll illustrate that by saying something briefly about three of our natural rights: liberty, free exercise of religion, and property. First, the natural right to liberty. We've been taught to believe pretty much that there are only two things that would deprive us of liberty: bringing back slavery and taking away the right to vote. But liberty means so much more. For example, take the right of the people peaceably to assemble, affirmed in both the federal and the Michigan Bill of Rights. People today seem to take that to mean, vaguely, the right to participate in public protests. Yes, that's one meaning of assemble, but not the most important meaning. The right to assemble also includes the liberty to get together with other people, others who might share a common hobby or share a common interest in a book, a reading group. It means the right to share Easter dinner with family and friends, the right to play with one's children in a public park without fear of being arrested for going outside and playing with a child in the park, and the right to get together with acquaintances in bars and restaurants, sharing hobbies. Today, the right peaceably to assemble has been abolished indefinitely. Most states have placed everyone under house arrest with permission to leave only for government-approved purposes. To illustrate how fundamental that natural right of assembly was thought to be at the time of the founding, when the Congress debated the First Amendment in 1789, Theodore Sedgwick, congressman, criticized the proposed right of assembly as, quote, redundant in light of freedom of speech, unquote. He said, if people freely converse together, they must assemble for that purpose. It is a self-evident, inalienable right which the people possess. It is certainly a thing that would never be called into question. It is derogatory to the dignity of the House of Representatives to descend to such minutiae, unquote. It was inconceivable to Sedgwick and to most Americans throughout our history that the liberty of freedom of assembly, getting together with your family and friends and whatever, doing ordinary innocent things, that right would be suspended or canceled. And yet here we are. At least for now, that right is gone. Second, freedom of religion. This freedom is better understood today than the right of assembly, but even that has been summarily canceled for a large number of Americans. In many states, you will be arrested if you worship together with others for the first time in American history. For the founders, the natural right to free exercise of religion was not just any old right, but a natural right of the highest importance to Christians and other believers, one which many founders regarded as the highest purpose of government altogether. Third, consider the natural right to acquire and possess property. Our founders spoke of that right frequently. They designed an elaborate set of laws to support the right to own property, to use one's own property in whatever non-dangerous terms they pleased, to acquire property by selling their labor or the product of their labor in a nationwide free market. Today, as you know, most of America has been denied the right to acquire and possess property on the terms they choose. Instead, any use or sale of property is presumptively forbidden, with some exceptions reluctantly granted by government in the case of, quote, essential, unquote, businesses. The deprivation of this right may be viewed as a necessity by those whose paychecks are assured, those who work for government, those who work for wealthy nonprofits, wealthy universities. But for everyone else, the loss of a job means the loss of income that would otherwise support themselves and their families. The natural right to acquire property is not an abstraction in a high school civics textbook for someone who has lost his job. I hear every day of another American thrown into fewer hours, lower pay, or laid off, including here in Hillsdale, many such cases. I hear every day of businesses shutting down by the thousands all over America. Among my friends and acquaintances and their relatives, the people protesting the crackdown are people with a real stake in society, as in a job and bills to pay. They are not motivated by esoteric debates about political philosophy, the rights of man, the natural rights. They don't have a walk-in closet full of moral signifiers that they use to display their membership in narrow identity groups. They just try to live their lives as best they can under conditions set for them. those conditions are becoming untenable now, and so they are making as much noise as they can about it. Around the world, I'm going to quote a political scientist now who made the following statement, which I don't necessarily endorse. Around the world, the governmental shutdown of the economy and society in the effort to contain the pandemic threatens human life and liberty. And if human life, he meant human life because people need to work. They need to produce income to buy the things they need. And if it's not ended soon, he continues, people will have the natural right to resist through civil disobedience or even revolution, unquote. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. God willing, our rulers will wake up in time to prevent it. Still, when government undertakes a deliberate policy of depriving people of their liberties in the name of public health, and depriving people of their livelihoods in the name of public health, not for a brief moment, but indefinitely, what else can one expect? Thank you.
Well, thank all three of you. And I have a question for each of you, and I'm going to go in reverse order. So the initial predictions about this virus was that it was going to kill 2 million Americans. And that doesn't look like that now. It doesn't look like it's anything near that. But what if that were true? How would you go about fighting it under the principles of freedom, Tom?
You would, okay, in the first place, you're saying that the people already were dying in large numbers? Is that your premise?
Mm-hmm.
In very large numbers?
Yeah.
Because we don't have that. We never had that. We had predictions. We had models. We had studies from organizations, many of which were funded by the Bill Gates Foundation, which is a foundation who has a private interest in expanding vaccinations and is in working in a close relationship with Big Pharma. So we don't have that situation. We don't know what that situation would be like. What the founders would say is that's something that people in their private dealings, in their private life, would mostly be able to contain, or in extreme cases, as Adam rightly pointed out, temporary and very localized confinement of people who were actually sick, or of people who were in a particular area, very small area, hotspot, that needed to be dealt with. We could do something like that on a very short, very temporary basis, should it actually have come to that, which it never did. All the predictions have turned out to be false with regard to the extent and danger of the virus.
What about the claim that the death count is way lower because we've done this magnificent lockdown?
Well, if you've seen the graphs put out by our CDC and others, the graphs themselves reveal that the virus was on the downturn and was already had already reached the minimum at the time the crackdown occurred. The crackdown has been not only useless from the point of view of stemming the virus, according to the CDC's own information, but is now actually positively harming human life in America and around the world.
There you go. So, Adam, the police power is an old thing, right? It's a common law power.
It is.
And it's a general authority to, it comes from England, therefore, and it's a general authority to protect the health, safety, general welfare, and morals of the people. And you're saying it's qualified because this is a country built on the principles of freedom. Let's think about that. You admit that the state can legislate in an area if it does contribute to those goals.
Mm-hmm.
But the limit is in the fact that it's supposed to be helping us be free. So elaborate that a little bit. Like, what would be the difference between the police power in England today versus here?
Yeah, that's a good question. And some of this, I'll have to admit, my what I don't know about the history of England, except for what connects with us. I will say, for one thing, the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament, that we've never recognized our legislative branches, even if they are elected by us, to be in and of themselves sovereign. That we have a more fundamental law, and that under that law is a fundamental principle of the natural rights of human beings. And by the way, actually not just freedom, also life. And that's not to say whether every response to this has been the correct one, but I think what that means is we don't have the power to dictate justice, whether it is a popularly elected assembly or whether it is a bureaucrat. And that therefore, when we think of these things, when we think of power, power is not the definer of right. Right defines power. In some ways, that's the difference between Douglas and Lincoln on the question of slavery, how one decides that.
Great. That means and I want to draw that out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It is certainly true that in Britain, if a parliament passes a law, it's sovereign. No court can overrule it. And we don't have that here, you're saying, because it's fundamental that the source of the authority of the government is us. And we give it to them for some purposes, and those cannot be changed, whatever the police power may have said in some other country.
Right, and I would even add, why do we have consent of the governed? And it comes from a deeper principle of the equal natural rights of individuals. And so therefore, I would say even consent of the governed is limited by why consent is there in the first place. Again, going back to Lincoln, Douglas says we'll solve slavery by voting on it. And Lincoln says, why do you vote? Because one man can't rule another without his consent. So therefore, one cannot vote to do something that would undermine the very reason for voting. And I think that is something to make concrete. One has to ask on every issue related to how states are responding to this virus.
I don't know how many of you watching have been to virtual church, but I have, and it's not quite the same, is it?
Comment about the state police powers.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
of the things that we Americans tend to forget is every state has its own constitution. And it's just as binding on the state government as the federal is on the federal government. And, whatever powers the state legislature gives to Gretchen Whitmer here in Michigan, it's still under the umbrella of the Michigan State Constitution and of the 14th Amendment, which also protects, limits what states can do. And so when she suspends the right of people to go to work and the right to freedom of assembly, the right to freedom of religion, sure, she can cite this power that the legislature gives her to declare an emergency. That power, the state can't exceed in its law powers granted under the Constitution. It can't constitutionally make a law that's unconstitutional. And that is, in fact, the legal situation that most of these governors are in around the country. They're in violation of their own constitutions. And I've looked at Michigan. I know many other states have the same bills of rights.
Governor of New Jersey, whoever he is, was asked the question, does this order violate the Bill of Rights of New Jersey and the federal government? And he replied, that's above my pay grade. But
yes, I think that's the mentality, unfortunately, of most American politicians today.
yeah, and they're using authority, and that's where they get it from. It's, before it's over, I can tell everybody that I've known these guys, since before they were born almost. A couple of them one of them's older than me, but I'm going to get them to say something optimistic before it's over. Somebody has to say something optimistic, or we'll call the panel a failure. The politics department of Hillsdale College loves the American Revolution and classic political philosophy and some modern political philosophy, but that doesn't make them particularly bright and optimistic about current affairs. Okay, the police power. And what would you do in this situation? What?
I think that given the extent of the outbreak, as the others on the panel have said, localized containment measures, and let's take our own example here in Michigan. We're one of the worst states in terms of raw numbers, but virtually all of that is in Metro Detroit. So any kind of containment measures, large-scale containment measures, should be limited to those areas which are heavily affected. Quarantines should be quarantines of people who are actually infected or who are at high risk, and then like people who, if you're working in one of these wards in a hospital, then you should be restricted in terms of where you go when you're off duty. But then beyond that, citizens should be trusted to act like responsible citizens, and if they are high risk, and we know what those high risk groups are, then they should stay home. And I think it's perfectly legitimate also for things to happen like what stores have done this under order in this case, but this was even happening voluntarily in many cases, having okay, we're going to have a special hour in the morning for people in high risk groups to come in and shop in our grocery store, right, so that they can get things without being exposed to the larger population. Okay, well that's fine, but much of that, almost all of that, could be done voluntarily.
Yeah, and figured out by the people involved. I'm having an email correspondence with a guy that I don't always agree with, and he likes all these shutdowns. And I pointed out to them that my wife, who's a big gardener, can buy a garden hose right now. She can't buy seeds, and it's spring, and that part is roped off. And the point is, that was decided in the governor's office. And I'm under the impression that the governor is a human being. And I know that I can't have meaningful conversations with more than 7 or 8 or 9 people a day. Right? So 7 or 8 or 9 people are making lists of what's essential to the people of Michigan. And the light way they say that colleges have to go to online, well, we've done that, and we're probably good at it. I mean, we're doing this, for example. And we have these very motivated students. And we have a culture here it's just marvelous, right? And they miss each other, and they want to be with each other because it's just a fact. And I don't know if there's anybody working for the government anywhere in America who knows this fact, that the great authors on education say that the conversations among the students are at least as productive as their conversations in class. And they befriend themselves, and they can talk. And the point is, those people, it would be astonishing if somebody in Michigan government, most astonishing of all, if somebody in the Michigan Department of Education actually knew that fact, right? But anybody who works in a good college knows that. And that means that it's just crazy, this thing. And if it were necessary, first of all, there'd need to be a demonstration of that. And there's not been. That's what I think. We need to come back to school. Okay. Anybody got any questions for anybody else? Or anything more to say?
If I could pick up on one thing you were saying, and I've thought about this, the separation of powers. And it seems that what's one reason, Kevin was saying presidents like to declare war. Why is that? Because that tends to be the situation where there is an emergency of that kind, that they're most in power, where they get to exercise their decision, their unity. And there may be a place for that even outside of war in certain circumstances. I think there is actually. But as something progresses, that can't become the normal. And one issue that I hope to see more of is courts and legislatures that bring judgment and deliberation, according to the founders, in, stepping in and starting to say that decisiveness may lack the wisdom long term to actually, even where there might be legitimate attempts at safety, to actually do that, to actually distinguish why you can't buy certain things. Why does that have anything to do with public safety? And that's something that I think hopefully does not get lost in the midst of this, in addition to questions of federalism.
You wanted someone to say something positive. I have something positive that I'd like to say.
As do I, so go ahead.
And that is this,
Okay.
that accomplishing the goals, the ultimate political goals that I think many of us hold to, which is to say that the dismantling of the administrative state, the restoration of constitutional government, the re-elevation of the principles of the laws of nature and nature's God, all of that requires a critical mass of public support. And at present, that critical mass does not exist. Right? And in order to obtain that, I think that's going to require getting the support of people who do not now support that goal and cannot be persuaded by ordinary means. And I think the only way that some of those people were going to be reached was by having them be affected by the Leviathan state in some tangible way that made them aware, directly aware, that made them feel that there was a problem. And I think there's at least a possibility, and you see this with some of these protests that are going on, I think there's at least a possibility that all of this overreach may have contributed to that in the long term. So that's something to be positive about.
Okay. I agree with that.
I'd like to add that on the positive side, optimistic side, is that this country is still governed by elections ultimately. And it's true the electorate, the voters, have gone along with a good deal of what Kevin was just talking about, the consolidation of the modern state and his dictatorial tendencies. On the other hand, when things get out of control and they begin to feel the pain of the mismanagement that we're now currently suffering, they will act. You're seeing that in these demonstrations now. City by city around the country, spreading. The first demonstrations, people were carefully socially distancing, the 6 feet. Now they're starting to just come together and be right together in a big crowd. Like, you people need to stop this nonsense. We need to go back to work. I was talking to my neighbor Wednesday, in an illegal conversation in their living room, in which they were talking to me about, this. You can't really have life. The right to life isn't really being preserved when you are in prison in your own house and not allowed to go outside. Life is activity. Aristotle said life is activity. And people resent that, and now they're getting angry, and politicians are beginning to notice, and they will begin to notice a great deal more soon. I'm very optimistic that these policies will be reversed in the very near future. Some places it'll take longer than others, but we're going to be building back up again. It's going to be a long, hard slog. It's going to be much harder than people say, than people right now understand. We're going to have a worldwide depression, I believe. But there's one way to stop it, and that's to start getting out of it. If you're in a hole, stop digging.
So I'll mention that Brian Westbury, whom I had a conversation in this series yesterday, and I mentioned him in Primus too. He's my favorite economist, and he's a very data-driven guy and a very decent, good guy. And he says it's going to take 2 years to get out of this. And if we do everything right, it's going to take 2 years to get back where we were. And where we were, by the way, was at a great peak. I mean, unemployment rates were at historically low levels, and they were reaching especially down into people who hadn't had jobs for a long time. And you see what a vindication that is? I heard many conversations. I wouldn't say I agreed with this, but I didn't disagree, that said that those people have just got used to never having a job, and they'll never go to work. Well, come to find out, human nature is a persistent thing, right? They want to work. They want to be responsible for themselves. And just put these numbers together, right? The American economy produces about $2 trillion a month. And Brian Westbury said that the cost of this is up to $4 trillion now. And sure enough, what we're doing is we're taking what the American economy would produce and borrowing it against the future so people can live inside their houses, right? How long can that go on? I mean, 6 months is a lifetime with numbers like that. And there are people talking about 6 months. I mean, there's a college in Boston that has announced that it's not going to have in-person classes in the fall. Well, I'm saying that we're going to have in-person classes in the fall because that's what we do. In 175 years, not in the Civil War, not in the Second or First World War, not in the Great Depression, was this campus emptied of students. And now it is. It's just indignant making to me. Anything else? So thank you, gentlemen. As you can tell, these guys are pretty good.